Well, welcome. I'm John Weber, and I'm the executive director of the museum, and it's great to have everyone here tonight. This for our Lijin Collection Arts of Asia Distinguished Lecture Series. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Darielle Mason, and she will receive a full introduction from my colleague, Ann Rose Kitagawa, the museum's chief curator of collections and Asian art and director of academic programs, in a moment. Ann Rose organized tonight's event, so I'm grateful to you for that. I'm also thrilled to welcome Vinnie Zhang, whose generous support has made tonight's event and the lecture series possible. So thank you, Vinnie, please. Great to have you back in the museum coming up from the Bay Area. Now, before turning things over to Ann Rose and our speaker, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Oregon and the GSMA are located on the Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions to their communities at the UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art wishes to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya peoples of the Willamette Valley of Eugene, Chinook, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, Tualatin, and other tribes and bands of the Portland area, and the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw of the Charleston area. We express our respect for all federally recognized tribal nations of Oregon, and this includes the Burns Paiute tribe, Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquel Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We also express our respect for all other displaced indigenous peoples who call Oregon home. And we have worked a lot with people of Oregon tribes and exhibited work here, and are working now with a member of the Grand Ronde tribe on an artist land acknowledgement, which will be put up in the museum come the fall. And the language that you just heard, if you go to events, you might hear this again and again, and it begins to seem rote, but it was negotiated out between the president's office and the tribes, which are sovereign governments. So it's important that the actual language be spoken as it was negotiated. Now, I want to thank Ann Rose and all of our colleagues whose work made tonight's event possible. Thanks also to our members and patrons who are here tonight, to the university for supporting us. And Ann Rose, take it away, it's all yours. Please welcome our distinguished speaker.
So welcome to all of you. My heart is just bursting with joy because I have been waiting for years for this event to transpire. We have wanted to bring Dr. Darielle Mason here ever since I got here. And unfortunately, COVID intervened, and so it was not possible to do so until now. But actually, this works in our favor because she has been doing incredible research about this South Indian temple at the Philadelphia Museum for, dare I say it, 27 years, give or take? Yes. So we are just going to get a small snippet of the amazing scholarship that she has produced. Dr. Darielle Mason has an undergraduate degree from Williams and a graduate degree from Penn. She is one of the most inspiring curators that I have ever had the privilege of working with. And the opportunity to listen to her speak about sculpture and architecture is something I'm so delighted to be able to share with all of you. At risk of thoroughly embarrassing her, we always talk about people and the wonderful works that they've done. I have brought a show and tell of the amazing catalogs: Gods, Guardians, and Lovers, temple sculptures from North India, AD 700 to 1200, intimate worlds, Indian paintings from, these are all from my personal collection, from the Alvin Obelisk collection, Kanta, a show that made me cry when I saw it at the Philadelphia Museum, about these beautiful hand-woven textiles that are made of recycled sari material. And they have an astonishing collection, which she worked with other colleagues to present to the public. And it's now, even if you look in the Sundance catalog, they're selling Kanta textiles. So I think curators have more power than we think. Her fabulous Pulkari catalog, another textile catalog, and of course, the subject of our talk tonight, Storied Stone, came out in 2022, a long-standing study of this amazing monument in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. For those of you who have been there, this is known, but for those of you who haven't, the Philadelphia Museum of Art is truly distinguished by the architecture that was brought and runs as a spine through the traditional parts of the museum. And this temple room is a crowning jewel. And it is a very complicated work of art with a very complex history. And it is wonderful to see someone who is a scholar, a connoisseur, and someone who has thought not just in the 20th century connoisseurship ways, but also in 21st century post-colonial views about this work of art and the complexities of its creation, its development over time, where the work of art has lived at various moments and in what configurations, and how it has been revisioned for the present. It's a continuing story. There is never a final answer to any of these questions, but this particular scholar's curiosity and scholarship and passion will be made manifest to you this evening. So I also want to take the opportunity to thank Vinnie Zhang for the wonderful support for this Lijin lecture series. I wanted to thank all of my colleagues who have moved mountains to make such a lovely event for all of us, and delicious food from Noisette, which doesn't hurt. So with that, Dr. Darielle Mason.
So it is such an honor to be asked here to present the Lijin Distinguished Lecture, and to be back in this fantastic, oh, sorry about that. Let's get us over here. You hearing me? Yes. Okay. I usually have too loud a voice, so I don't want to scream into the mic. But to be back in your glorious university and exquisite Eugene in the spring. My gratitude to Vinnie Zhang. This is really a pleasure to be able to have a lecture here and to be able to come to present this work to all of you. To John, Executive Director, and to Anne Rose, Chief Curator, and for recognizing that issues that I'm going to talk about, which include provenance, authenticity, heritage, how these break the boundaries of nation states and really speak to everything that's in the institution. My personal gratitude also to Anne Rose and to her husband Ian Coleman for their abiding friendship and outstanding hospitality. And for facilitating the talk to the team at the museum and for that very, very elegant reception that we just had the pleasure of attending. So from that, I will head right into the meat of things. Academics, governments, and the press increasingly espouse the position that all objects from decolonized regions, especially those perceived as sacred or considered authentic examples of historic art or heritage, should be returned to the nation states of their ostensible origins. This movement has grown in combative opposition to the position of many collectors, dealers, and museum professionals who legitimize retaining ownership on the grounds of preserving and exhibiting a heritage they espouse as belonging to all humankind. More and more, these two camps, let's call them the returners and the retainers, fuse their ideologies with their self-identities and their self-interests. Little space remains for exploring whether ideas of what is sacred, authentic, art, or heritage might be fluid instead of fixed across cultures, times, and even individual lives. In this polarized universe, the very idea of nuance is sometimes seen as betrayal. When our historical research uncovers instances of flux instead of stasis in definitions and power structures, we even risk inciting the wrath of both the returners and the retainers. Today, I'll begin with an overview of the unique museum gallery in Philadelphia called the South Indian Temple Hall. A look at the stones, the individuals involved in their acquisition, travels, installations, and interpretations, and present a taste of the detective work that led me to reconstruct their origins. I'll conclude, though, with a close look at a dialogue that happened between 1934 and 1943. I found this dialogue mostly in the museum's archives, but it's only recently, in fact, after the book was published, that I've come to recognize how it subtly but profoundly challenges our assumptions about the static versus fluid nature of definitions, including how societies designated as traditional, usually designated from the outside, consider what is sacred. The so-called South Indian Temple Hall gallery stands on the top floor of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's now the third floor, it used to be the second floor. When you walk into it, you feel that you're entering a coherent environment and a religious space. In reality, it's a composite of 60 huge, separately carved granite blocks linked together by molded cement, and not necessarily even from the same building. Since first assembled in Philadelphia over a century ago, the museum has termed it the Temple Hall, or the Mandapam, which means in Tamil, the language of southeastern India where the stones were found, Temple Hall. So the Temple Hall is an ensemble built to resemble a specific type of architecture. Each curator, each individual responsible for changing its installation and interpretation over the past century has understood the architectural form and atmosphere differently. I'm also part of that history, having made numerous decisions on interpretation, lighting, color, access, and physical flow. My decisions also changed over the last 27 plus years, according to my own research about the block's origins. Like my predecessors, and probably like most of you, I'd been taught that a curator makes magic happen behind the opaque armor of the museum, the monolithic institution where the struggles of research and reasoning must remain invisible to the public. But I've long been uncomfortable with this stance, this assumed anonymity. And isn't the real excitement for all of us not the final tableau, but the process of how it came to be? Despite efforts at community input, our visitor studies, our prototyping, it's hard to change habits, especially in a big museum like Philadelphia. We continue to conceal the messy mass behind the armor, a mass of concepts, interpretations, expertise, prejudices, ethical stances, and especially individuals. And yeah, somewhere there's got to be a dragon behind the scenes. So we conceal all this, and then we produce fully clad perfection. And I'm showing you two Indian paintings that have absolutely nothing to do with the temple hall, except that they come from India, to highlight that opposition between the illusion we present and the reality. Transparency might, as some museum professionals argue, lessen the public's faith in the institution's authority. Though from behind the armor, it's pretty evident how often authority itself is an illusion. Now, I don't by any means disrespect either the museum or the reality of expertise. Instead, the case study of the Indian Temple Hall helped me recognize that it's humans who seek to create flawless gallery experiences, but that humans have flaws. What becomes evident and impressive, especially as seen in their own words preserved in archives, is that these experts, the vast majority of them, even from a century ago, and pretty much to a person, aimed to create for the public an experience that was educational, awe-inspiring, respectful, and, to use their repeated term, authentic. And most visitors do experience the hall as unified and authentic. This is the case even for those most intimately familiar with the type. For example, after performing in the hall, legendary dancer Malavika Sarukai said that while she was aware she was not in the proximity of God in the sanctum, familiarity transported her through memory to a state of communion. I thought that was one of the most beautiful things I had ever heard about a museum space. Even I get the urge to take off my shoes in respect every time I enter. In active Hindu temples, a mandapam is a place where God and devotees merge. Most Hindu temples comprise the sanctum, sanctorum, it's called the garbhagriha, or the womb room, where the deity appears in their primary form, plus one or more halls, mandapams, where people gather for religious activities, to ritually interact with the god in various kinds of worship, that takes place in these halls, and also for private worship, lighting a diya, a candle, or saying your own private prayer, or giving a wish, as well as what we might think of, although there really is no duality, as secular activities, like celebrating life cycle events, chatting, feasting, attending performances and lectures, gathering as a community, or just relaxing. Here you see a hall during the bathing festival of the great Hindu god Vishnu, in his form as his man-lion avatar, or earthly incarnation. The deity has been ritually re-embodied from his stone form in the sanctum into a portable bronze image that you see right here. And this portable bronze image can be carried into the hall, where he's bathed with auspicious liquids, like milk and turmeric water that cooled him off, because he's a very angry form of Vishnu, and then shown off to his adoring devotees. The festival you see here happened in 2016, in the very same temple complex from where the museum's pieces were purchased over a century earlier. The name of this temple complex is the Madana Gopala Swami. Bit of a tongue twister. It's actually just a name for the young god Krishna that means the enchanting cowherd lord. It stands in the city of Madurai, Tamil Nadu, in southeastern India. The style of its carving of the temple itself and of the museum's blocks dates it to about the mid-1500s, something confirmed by related inscriptions, and built under a dynasty known as the Madurai Nayakas. The individual elements in Philadelphia include lions and lotus drops that would have rested on top of a variety of elaborately carved pillars. Some of the pillars have square bases. You can probably see this pretty easily. And some are compound with monumental figures of deities and mythological heroes emerging from one side. Finally, there are segments of a relief showing episodes from the Hindu text, the Ramayana, a monumental ancient religious poem, often termed an epic. In Philadelphia, the Ramayana segments are set well overhead. As you can just see right here, between the lions. But the story is only partial in Philadelphia, and its narrative sequence is jumbled up. The most surprising part of my first visit to the Madurai Madanagopala Swami, and I had been to the city before, but I had never visited that temple, although I knew about Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Hall at the time. The most surprising part of my first visit to the Madanagopala Swami in 2004 was finding many more Ramayana fragments exactly matching, but not repeating the stories of those in the museum. The fragments in India had at some time been reset into the exterior wall of the temple's central shrine. You can see that following all along here, and then the opposite side of the building as well. Seeing them here was the beginning of my detective journey. The Ramayana recounts the adventures of the hero god Rama, another Vishnu avatar. Rama is considered the ideal of kingship, and like all avatars, was born in human form to restore cosmic order by subduing a particularly powerful anti-god or demon. For millennia and into the present, this tale has been meaningful as religion, morality lesson, political teaching, and entertainment in many parts of the world. It's kept up to date in texts, images, comic books, novels, performances, and videos of all types. Here you see the fight between the two contenders for the throne of the kingdom of the monkeys. It's a great adventure story too. And you see them from 3 different times and places. On the 500-year-old Temple Hall relief fragment in Philadelphia at the top, on an 18th century royal manuscript on the left, and as a still from a recent animation on the bottom right. Gradually, I managed over the years to visit many temples patronized by the Madurai Nayaka dynasty. The halls of these buildings are unique for the towering gods and heroes that emerge from their pillars, and they get bigger and bigger over time from the 1500s into the 1900s. And you can see them here towering over the people standing next to them. These gods just lean down over you. They're mind-boggling. These temples, especially their great halls, constitute some of the most dramatic, monumental, and just incredible combinations of architecture and sculpture anywhere in the world. I find it extraordinary how ignored they are, even by historians of Indian art, who for generations have in large part considered them too late to study. Imagine dismissing the Taj Mahal, St. Peter's Basilica, Himeji Castle, Monticello, or the Masjid-i-Shah in Isfahan, because they were made after 1500. In looking at other Madurai Nayaka halls, I came to understand how the Ramayana reliefs would have been set into the architecture. I had taken photos of the pieces in Madurai, and back in Philadelphia, I combined them with those in my own museum to see if, like a jigsaw puzzle, I could create a full story. Eventually, it actually worked. And with it, I was able to determine the layout and dimensions of the original hall. The result, and you see it on your left with the actual books from the Ramayana written in. The result showed a masterpiece of storytelling. The architect, who would also have been a learned priest, had re-envisioned this huge epic so that it precisely fit his architectural format. And he had to retell it from scratch to fit his building's requirements. In fact, there's very few complete narratives in this location in any Madurai Nayaka halls. And as far as I know, this is the only retelling of the Ramayana. But no matter how far I got with the architecture and archives, I also realized how many pieces of the larger historic puzzle were still missing. So like any good fictional detective, and yes, I read far too much of that literature, I wound up with a truckload of red herrings, clues that led me to all sorts of dead ends. The book that became Storied Stone had begun as a standard study of a museum masterpiece told in a standard museum voice. It had also begun as a provenance research to determine the block's origins that would also prove or disprove the legitimacy of the museum's ownership. As I wrote, though, I found it transforming not only into a thick case study, but also into a critique of museum practice by an insider to the museum world. When told from the inside, it's possible to unpack how institutions lean on the practicalities of what's going on. And we don't see that when we're coming into an institution and looking at those beautifully perfected exhibitions. It's also necessary to hide these things and to look perfect for reasons of funding, for reasons of audience, and for reasons of expectation. But a critique from the inside of the museum remains rare. And the void's been filled by museum studies literature, written, no insult intended, by career academics, who often take the product as if it were the process. In writing, I came to reflect on what it means to be a US-raised, non-South Indian heritage woman working as a curator of South Asia's mostly religious art in a major US museum, a role I've now played for well over half my life. Between 2020 and 2021, I wrote the book from my isolated home office. But I didn't write in isolation. During that time, our world changed, and so did I. As crowds marched to the museum steps in support of Black lives, I confronted anew questions about equality and power, and I felt empowered to release my personal voice, to become more honest and allow my professional practice to merge with my multicultural childhood and later life, my own encounters with colonial structures and with prejudice, and my decades of grappling with the ethics of the art market. Rather than being defensive, I made myself take another look at what it means for a so-called encyclopedic art museum in the US to own architectural fragments created as parts of religious structures outside of the European and American context. What I came to recognize is that there's no answer that fits all circumstances. Along with my own voice, I wanted the book to have a more holistic view, so I commissioned a short essay from 4 different perspectives and used these to end each of the 4 chapters. The first is a family history by 2 of the grandnieces of the actual woman who purchased the blocks in Madurai. Their contribution resurrects the attitudes of Philadelphia's white Protestant elite in the early decades of the 20th century. Crispin Branfoot, the leading specialist on the architecture of the Madurai Nayaka halls, ends the 2nd chapter. Annalise Seastrand concludes the 3rd, with an exploration through mural painting of how imagery of royalty and divinity overlap. The book ends with an essay by Archana Venkateshan, who weaves her exquisite translations of Tamil hymns to Vishnu with poetic prose that viscerally evoke the emotional power of these halls for devotees. But let's jump back in time to see how the blocks arrived in Philadelphia in the first place. In late 1911, Adeline Pepper Gibson, daughter of one of Philadelphia's wealthiest families, and her new husband, Theodore Marshall, set off for their 2-year honeymoon around the world. After traveling across multiple continents, they spent a good deal of time in India. They first floated about on a boat in Kashmir, together with a borrowed grand piano and a portable darkroom. And then they visited archaeological sites across the northern and central regions. Finally, they headed south and arrived in Madurai in March of 1913. The couple's first stop was the Meenakshi Sundareswaram temple, known by the British as the Great Pagoda. Among the largest religious establishments on earth, it had only recently become a stop for European and American tourists on their grand tour. Here the Marshalls caught the torchlight evening procession where Sundareswara, Shiva, the beautiful Lord, in his silver palanquin, joins his wife in her bedchamber. The Marshalls were awed by the riot of activity. You can see a much more recent photograph of that on the lower right. They came back to the same temple the next day, and someone, we don't know who, mentioned a nearby temple where loose granite carvings had been thrown away. The Marshalls found the site, the Madanagopala Swami. There they discovered masses, not just a few, but masses of elaborately carved architectural elements piled high and haphazardly strewn within the compound walls. Soon they had selected 62 blocks, all large and some absolutely enormous. Next, they approached the temple authorities and asked if they could buy the blocks. Exactly who these authorities were is not entirely clear. Whether patron, trustee, priest, or some combination thereof. But the temple seems to have agreed readily. However, if there were written receipts, which would have been really unlikely at the time, they have yet to be discovered either in Philadelphia or in India. Fortunately, though, Adeline kept a travel diary, and I've read the sections describing their visit to Madurai. Unfortunately, her style is extremely terse, more like a list of their activities, often omitting names, titles, and details. But what we can infer about the transaction is that the couple didn't bargain on the temple's asking price. Nor could I find a hint, and this is key, that devotees or anyone involved with the temple considered this material to be sacred in any way. Neither were there complaints made that the transfer to America, which was widely known locally, might constitute a loss of heritage. a loss of local continuity or memory. While this seems really surprising from our perspective, the general practice in Tamil Nadu over 1,000 years had been to replace deteriorating temples with newer ones for the sake of properly housing the divine and honoring the sacred site. Only the British archaeological community might have bemoaned the demolition of a 16th century temple or architecture, and even they considered this late kind of building to not be of particular interest except maybe for their inscriptions. What concerned devotees were the stationary icons, the gods incarnate in stone, who had been awakened to permanently inhabit and radiate from the sanctum sanctorum, the most sacred space inside the temple. Devotees were, and are, also concerned with processional icons, since that's where the stone sanctum god is ritually awakened in a portable bronze body to visit the mandapam and the city beyond. These stone and bronze gods are physical embodiments of the divine. Excuse me. They're physical embodiments of the divine with whom devotees directly interact. They're powerful and honored like the highest royalty. Other parts of the temple structure, even those with images of gods carved on them, like the pillars, narrative reliefs, or brackets, this usually happens when you're sitting in the audience, not standing up and talking. Other parts of the temple structure, even those with images of gods carved on them, like the pillars, narrative reliefs, or brackets that we've seen, are parts of the shelter or palace for the divine. At least through the early decades of the 1900s, these structural elements appear to have had value and meaning only when they were still in use on sanctified ground. Once they fell down or were taken apart and moved, such as in the process of rebuilding, old structural pieces lost their value and their power. Because stone is expensive to carve, the structural pieces might be reused for other buildings. Sometimes they were smashed into gravel for roads or railway beds, and very occasionally a special image might gain new and different life as an icon in another location. Adeline and Theodore completed their financial agreement with the temple. To be on the safe side, they even asked the British Archaeological Department for permission to take the pieces with them, although it wound up that the British at that point were not responsible for this temple in any way. Over the next few days, they arranged for the pieces to take the very long journey to Philadelphia, via train to the south of India, a barge to Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, land travel across Ceylon. Imagine this, 60 plus huge blocks of granite, a ship to New York, and transport to Philadelphia. Now, why did this rich Philadelphia couple purchase an enormous load of carved granite in India and ship it home at humongous expense? For over a century, neither the museum nor Adeline's family had any idea. In 2020, I found evidence that the University of Pennsylvania's Architectural Archive held 1914 renderings of a, quote, country house that was being designed for one Theodore J. Marshall, Adeline's husband, by a prominent Philadelphia architect. But the archive was closed for COVID, and the available images weren't high enough resolution to see if the Indian pieces were going to be incorporated. With literally days before the book went into print, the archive reopened. Looking in person at these renderings, the evidence was unmistakable. Around the living room, the central red oval here, black shapes represent the irregular footprint of the museum's great figural pillars. So you can just see these funky shapes here. Those are the pillars. In the red oval on the left, you can just see light pencil sketches of the same figural pillars from the side. And on the right oval, it's barely possible to see pillars with lion capitals supporting the front portico. At the far right, in another rendering, you actually see a detail of a lion capital nestled into the corner of the exterior of the building. That's a little easier to actually read. And there was a lot of other evidence. In fact, really looking forward to doing a whole article with this on the guy who runs the archive at Penn, who happens to be a specialist on this architect and his firm. So there's lots more to go from there. In the 1910s, decorating with spolia, or fragments of Greek, Roman, Romanesque, Gothic, or Islamic ancient architecture, was a common practice among America's wealthiest families. But the Marshalls' intention to use ancient Indian temple fragments to ornament their grand house may well have been unique, and so a social coup. After the Stones reached Philadelphia, they languished while a few events happened in quick succession. The couple's marriage dissolved, their house was never built, and World War I erupted. Adeline and her brother, a doctor, funded a war hospital in France. She traveled there herself in 1918 to help as a civilian translator and secretary, but never returned, dying of pneumonia at the age of 36. To honor her, her family decided to donate what they called Adeline's Temple to either the city or the New Art Museum. The museum was then in its original Beaux-Arts home at Memorial Hall, a building constructed for the great 1876 Centennial Exhibition, the first U.S. World's Fair. The director of the museum at the time was Langdon Warner, a Chinese specialist and an archaeologist adventurer. Warner is probably best known for plundering the murals in the Buddhist caves at Dunhuang and bringing them back to Harvard, and as a model for the character of Indiana Jones, which you can see pretty clearly in the picture on your right. But he did recognize the importance of the blocks and convinced Adeline's family that they belonged at the museum where they could be properly looked after. Warner called this acquisition the greatest gift the museum had ever received. Spread across the museum's lawns, the florid carvings and strange deities became a national sensation. Although press information, if you read this article, it's hysterical, wasn't exactly accurate. They thought she'd taken an entire temple and dismantled it and carried it home. To find out what to do with the blocks, Warner invited from Boston the only Indian art historian then working in the United States, scholar extraordinaire Ananda Kentish Coomaraswamy. Although Coomaraswamy's father was Sri Lankan, he himself had grown up in England, but spent a good deal of time in Sri Lanka and southern India, including Madurai. Coomaraswamy seems to have had no qualms that the blocks were sacred and was familiar with the regional practice of temple rebuilding and renovating. On your left is the museum's first installation in Memorial Hall, designed by Coomaraswamy to resemble a Nayaka temple hall, as best he could. Standing within the large glass-roofed gallery, the figural pillars form a central aisle leading toward an altar-like construction. So this is the central aisle of the pillars, and then leads toward an altar-like construction made up of piled up fragments of the Ramayana, which are completely out of place, and sitting on top of them is a large, she was then thought to be Tibetan, we now know she's Mongolian, Buddhist image of the goddess Tara. Along the sides of the room run the square pillars interspersed with objects from South and Southeast Asia from the museum's own collection or on loan. The museum considered the Gibson gift so exciting that in 1920, even before the installation officially opened, they organized an enormous costume music pageant called the Building of the Temple. This 200-plus person extravaganza was in line with amateur theatricals so popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. That said, the building of the temple undoubtedly constituted one of the strangest and perhaps most disturbing events that ever took place in the museum. It was an Orientalist mashup, as you can see, filled with misunderstood Hindu deities, Chinese dancing girls, Maya prophets, this is the narrator, and even a greyhound standing in for an elephant. Storied Stone includes a richer description. I could have written a whole book about this one. It really takes the cake. It includes a richer description and analysis also of the racist content. It's not just underlying it, it's really right on the surface. That not only homogenized and made nonsense out of Asia, as you can see from the photos, but whose dialogue also propounded the already obsolete ideology of manifest destiny, the inevitable spread of the white man across America and by inference around the world. Although designed by Coomaraswamy, Horace Jain, head of the Oriental Department, almost immediately worried that the new gallery was not correct or complete due to missing pieces. Though Jain had never been in India, it bothered him that visitors might not receive an authentic, in his words, experience. In part, this was because Coomaraswamy had actually visited the site in 1921 and brought back several photographs that showed additional carved rubble remained lying around the compound. In 1925, the architect and architectural historian Fisk Kimball took over as director. This was not coincidentally the time when the city was building a new and larger home for the museum on Fairmount, where it stands today. The first part of this building opened in 1928, though the building and installation weren't completed until the early 1940s. One of Kimball's passions was to blend historical architectural environments, as Anne Rose mentioned, with traditional galleries exhibiting paintings and sculptures. Part of his plan for the museum's upper floor were intersecting architectural settings from around the world and across time. Following Jain, Kimball also saw the Mandapam as incomplete. In 1931, Kimball appointed as part-time Indian curator, the first Indian curator at the museum, William Norman Brown, or W. Norman Brown, the University of Pennsylvania's dynamic Sanskrit professor. Brown had partly grown up in India, and at the time he was hired by the museum, was diving into studying illustrations as well as texts. Just as Brown was preparing to leave for a 1934 sabbatical in India, Kimball asked him to add Madurai to his itinerary. He wanted Brown to accomplish two tasks: confirm that the blocks were organized authentically, and purchase enough additional carving from the remaining rubble to complete the installation adequately. To frame the key 1934 to 43 dialogue I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, We need to reconstruct the origin of the blocks themselves, something that's been a long and confusing endeavor, and that takes up half the book. Were the stones part of the tumble-down temple where they were found, or did they come from somewhere else? Brown recognized that the forms of many of the Philadelphia carvings couldn't have fit into the symmetrical triple-shrined Madanagopalaswamy compound, and you see the plan on your right, judging from what actually remains standing, and you can see that today. Now this small temple, the Madanagopalaswamy, which you see part of over here, stands very near a much larger Vishnu temple called the Kudal Alagar. And I'm sorry for all of these names. I've tried to pare them down as much as possible. The Kudal Alagar temple is one of the 108 Divya Deshams, which are especially sacred sites praised by ancient poet saints dedicated to Vishnu. Many of the temples they visited are said to date to the Sangam era, which is the late BCE and early CE. But the region's practice of frequent temple rebuilding has left comparatively little architectural fabric from that time. The various parts of the Kudal Alagar were rebuilt, very often over the past millennium, including by the Madurai Nayakas in the late 16th century, about the same time as the Madanagopalaswamy. And if you look here, you see the Madanagopalaswamy, and this is an entrance tower, and this is the tower of the sanctum of the Kudal Alagar. You can see how just right next to one another they are. And this is the earliest photograph that we have of a section of the Kudal Alagar. So you see how close these two temples stand. You can see it even better on Google Earth, with the Madanagopalaswamy marked with a green star and the Kudal Alagar with a red. Now, here's the crucial piece. In the southeast corner of the Kudal Alagar compound stands a large sub-shrine dedicated to Vishnu's wife, Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, locally known as Mother of Vali. Thanks to the help of specialist colleagues, including Crispin Brandfoot and epigraphist Leslie Orr, I found out that the 16th century fabric of this goddess shrine was in disrepair. And in late 1907, the building was dismantled in preparation for an up-to-date shrine to properly house the goddess. This work was funded by a wealthy donor, one Mutu K.R.V. Alagappa Chettiar. As his name shows, the patron came from the Chettiar community, specifically the Natukotai Chettiars, who were the sort of upper rung of the Chettiars. The Chettiars are a Tamil-based merchant clan that made enormous fortunes in Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, initially as small bankers from the late 18th into the 20th century. They spent much of their fortunes back home, constructing grand palace houses and piously renovating and building temples to Vishnu, Shiva, and other Hindu deities across Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. The leftover blocks from the demolished Kudal Alagar goddess shrine were carted across the street where they were piled within the unused Madanagopalaswamy compound to be found by Adeline and Theodore in early 1913. So this means that the transfer must have taken place between 1908 and 1912. The new goddess shrine was finally completed and dedicated in 1923. And here we see the interior of that shrine relatively recently, built in what was termed modern style. Note the British front-facing lion and the very Europeanized flower pot on the base of the pillar. It follows a ground plan with interior ambulatory or walkway, typical of Chettiar patronized temples. The elegant dark stone structure entirely covers, although does not mimic, the footprint of the 16th century Nayaka shrine it would have replaced. Quite possibly the money from the Philadelphia couple that they'd paid for the older blocks might have gone into this rebuilding project. So director Fitzkimball sent Brown to Madurai to get the straight scoop on how the blocks should be arranged, and he did. But Kimball's primary aim was for Brown to buy more authentic pieces to complete the installation in Philadelphia. When Brown arrived in India, he wrote to F.H. Gravely, the director of the Madras Museum, requesting that his old friend, Curator of Archaeology, T.N. Ramachandran, accompany him to Madurai. But Ramachandran was ill with dengue fever, and Gravely substituted T.G. Aravamutan, lots more names, a lawyer who had made himself into an historian, archaeologist, and numismatist. Gravely convinced Brown that Aravamutan would be an invaluable part of his party because of his identity as a high caste devotee of Vishnu, who already knew many of the temple trustees in Madurai and could access religious structures that Brown could not as a non-Hindu, along with his legal training, historical knowledge, and fluency in English and Tamil. It's worth noting that both the Madanagopalaswamy and Kudal Alagar were always controlled by the same management. But in 1927, and so by the time Brown visited, the legal status of Hindu temple management in Tamil Nadu had changed. Instead of being under private devotee-chosen trustees, now the British government appointed trustees who ran the show, although the individuals were still devotees and of Indian origin. In their few days in Madurai, Brown, Aravamutan, and an unnamed draftsman found that a much larger than expected number of loose carved elements remained at the Madanagopalaswamy than Kumaraswamy's photos had indicated. They also figured out an astonishing amount about the original layout of the temple, as Brown's earlier plan showed. Most significantly, they developed the new theory on where the majority of the Philadelphia works originated. They speculated, though at that point they couldn't prove, that there were 16th century pieces, that the majority were 16th century pieces of the old goddess shrine of the Kudal Alagar that had been knocked down in 1907, as we've seen. Brown sent Kimball a long report on his findings, including alternatives for reinstalling the museum's Temple Hall gallery with the additional blocks he intended to purchase, although warning that, quote, our rearrangement shall not reproduce anything that ever actually existed, but we shall be able to present something that might plausibly have existed. The museum wanted the deal closed before Brown left India, so Aravamutan immediately began negotiations with the government-appointed trustee. Brown asked Aravamutan to keep silent on the fact that the blocks would go to America, not because they were sacred, but for fear that it would increase the asking price. Kimball had already raised more than enough money, so by 1935, everything appeared in place for the purchase and shipping. Yet, Aravamutan couldn't bring the trustee to the point of agreeing to the sale. Brown reported to Kimball that the negotiations were, quote, as delicate as a royal marriage. Indeed, in the end, the negotiations dragged on for over a decade. While this disappointed Kimball, it resulted in a correspondence that provides us with a rare glimpse into the subtle changes in definitions of sacrality, authenticity, heritage, and ownership that were happening at the time in Madurai and even in Philadelphia. Long dismissed as Brown's Indian helper, I've come to see Aravamutun's role as central to the story and very complicated. While not overtly political, his scholarship, including propounding the Tamil origins of South Asia's oldest civilization, reflects an ideology of South Indian superiority and a solidarity with the political cultural independence movement of the Madras Presidency and beyond. In his first message to Brown, Aravanmutun said that the local trustee was, quote, afraid public censure might fall on him for selling temple property, even though he should sell it honestly. A year or so later, he wrote that the trustee was now willing to sell, but that local worshippers wanted to renovate the Madanagopala Swami's collapsed North Shrine, and that a wealthy devotee had just gotten involved. Aravamutin asked that the museum give the worshippers more time to see if they could raise enough money to rebuild and also repurpose the older pieces into smaller shrines around the compound. If they could not raise enough money for the central shrine, the trustee thought they would want to sell the fragments to subsidize the major renovations. Yet another year passed. When Brown asked again, Aravamutin repeated that the trustee needed more time. Aravamutin's split loyalties were showing between the lines. In 1938, Brown wrote Kimball that, quote, in recent years, a great deal of feeling has arisen in India against selling any sort of antiquities from temples, especially to non-Hindus. But the museum had also run out of time. Using Brown's basic design, they finally installed the gallery with the pieces they did own, substituting faux finished cement for the supposedly missing blocks. You can see the construction actually happening here. It's literally built as part of the building. I mean, if it were ever to be tried to be taken out, they'd have to take the roof off and start from scratch. The Oriental Wing, as it was then called, opened in 1940. And you see looking into the temple hall here on your left. On your right, you see the south shrine of the Madanagopala Swami and just how closely Brown designed them to mimic one another. That same year, in 1940, the University of Pennsylvania published Brown's book, which was called A Pillared Hall from a Temple at Madurai, India, in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is actually an incredibly erudite study and amazing for the time and starting from scratch. So they've installed the gallery, it's opened. That should have been that, but it wasn't. In 1943, Brown asked Gravely, who had recently retired from the Madras Museum, if additional blocks might still be forthcoming. Gravely actually went to the site, but what he found was that the Ramayana fragments, the pieces the museum most desired, had just been built into the Madanagopala Swami's central structure. So on the top here, you see an upside down, one of the Ramayana pieces lying on the ground. I've flipped the photograph so that you can see it right side up. And just down below that, you see how it was installed into the wall. So they were sort of broken up where they needed to be and put into a relatively complete sequence, much more complete than what is in Philadelphia and much more logical, actually. And here you can see the bottom blocks of the wall cut out and moved upward to maintain the rhythm of the niches when the Ramayana was inset into a single line just above the moldings. So here's what the wall looked like originally. They cut that out, they moved it up here, and then they inset the Ramayana below it. Took a while to figure out what in the world was going on there. But many other pieces, especially pillars and brackets, remain scattered around the compound even as late as my first visit in 2004. Gravely, unlike the lawyer Aravamutan, must have shown the trustee images of the Philadelphia blocks, probably from Brown's 1940 book. Not surprisingly, the trustee requested that Philadelphia return the Ramayana pieces so that the Madanagopalaswamy could have a complete set. In a Hail Mary pass that he believed would satisfy both parties, gravely suggested to Brown that the trustee and devotees, something that the trustees and devotees might both find a happy solution. And that was that if the museum offered a full set of replica granite Ramayana reliefs done from photographs, Philadelphia would keep the authentic carvings and take the remaining authentic pieces from India in exchange for giving India a full, shiny new set, though the pieces in both Philadelphia and Madurai had already been installed in their respective buildings. It seems that Gravely didn't consider that views on sacrality and heritage might have changed a bit during the prior decades, as the movements for cultural as well as political independence from Britain escalated. It also appears that he didn't propose the idea of a new set to the Madurai trustee. But even if it had been acceptable, which seems unlikely, it was a no-starter for Philadelphia. Not only had they completed and opened the gallery, but they had no way to raise the large amount of money that would have been necessary to carve and transport an entirely new set of enormous granite blocks. Now, most discussions of decolonization assumed that present views and emotions mimic or at least reflect those of the past. But when purchased in 1913, the blocks seem to have been valued in Madurai not on the grounds of sacrality or heritage, but for the money they could bring to the temple, likely helping to build a better home for the goddess. Their antiquity, minimal by local standards, seems to have had meaning only, if at all, to European archaeologists and crazy rich Americans. As the 1920s and 30s progressed, the perspective of local devotees changed. In some ways, they came to share the European archaeological understanding that old things are of value for the sake of their oldness. Through this path, architectural elements that were once parts of sacred structures again became sacred in themselves, as conveyed by the statement that fragments of all old temples should remain in Hindu hands. So what was once rubble, valued for money, became sacred heritage, valued as embodying both the divine and group identity. Now, this is only a small part of what Storied Stone explores, since the book also looks into the period from 1940 to the present and speculates on where we might be going from here. But the primary point, that flux versus stasis, may be the norm for how groups and individuals define and value many object types, is something with major implications for how we approach provenance now and in the future. It recognizes that agency resides not solely in the colonizer or conqueror, but also in the multiple local as well as trans-regional hierarchies of power that shape and redefine that reshape definitions over time, layering and complicating our attempts to fix any uniform rubric of the ethics of ownership. Okay. I would be happy to take questions. Yes, our patron.
Yeah, okay, should I, would you repeat my question, or should I?
Or, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
what a mesmerizing story. So I guess my big question, and perhaps, a lot of other people share the same feeling, is what next? What is the next episode of this searching process?
As I said, in the book, there's a lot on, the detective work of finding what was there. And in that process, recognizing that the site where these blocks stood is another building. So even if by some strange, obviously they're out legally by US standards from 1913, but even if they were somehow to go back to India, there isn't any way to rebuild them into their original building. And they were deliberately taken down to give the goddess something more special and appropriate to her. They're damaged in ways that, there's broken noses, there's broken arms, there's parts of them that are very fragmentary. And it would have been a pretty tumble down building in the first place. So I think the future is certainly that as long as the Philadelphia Museum of Art is standing, they will continue to stay, and as long as the Madhumagopala Swami is standing, they will continue to stay. But the interesting thing is, when I first knew the Madhumagopala Swami in 2004, it was literally bankrupt. I talked to their major patron, and he said that I was at a festival, and he said he thought that the temple was going to have to be closed within a year. And it would stay there. It wouldn't be torn down, but it would just be closed because they couldn't support a priest or anything like that. Somehow, and I haven't entirely understood this, I think the internet has a lot to do with it, they have gained gradually gained money, more and more money. All of those pieces that were lying around, the big pillars and everything, have been built into additional sub-shrines, and they've refloored it with red marble from, old sandstone, and it's just flourishing. And there's festivals and all kinds of things happening there all the time. Lectures coming in, musicians, everything. So they're doing really well. And it's teaching something unique in the United States. So, one of the things that happened that I didn't talk about here was that it had been this very dark space with the lights deliberately turned down by my predecessor, the absolutely spectacular scholar Stella Cramrish, but she wanted it to look like a mysterious inner hall just before the sanctum, but you couldn't see the sculptures at all. Many of these kinds of halls are actually open to the courtyards on three sides, so you can see the light coming through. And so I made the choice to go in that direction, architecturally, rather than the way that she had seen it. And so we painted the walls bright blue from almost black. We added lots and lots of lighting, and then the original configuration had been 2 entries to the other galleries on either side and a false sanctum door in the middle, so that when you walked into the room, you saw just a blank wall and a very dark space. So we cut a hole in the wall. We closed up the sides. We now have temple saris that hang there, so you get a little bit of a sense of that. And we made a video, one still that I showed you. We made a video of a day in the life of the Madhumagopala Swami temple that plays as a loop in the space, so that you also get the sound and you can see a little bit of the color. And I think, and there's also a timeline of, this basic story. How did this thing get here? Because that's the question that we hear all the time. So I think more interpretation. I'm no longer the curator, but I would love to see it being given every so often to a contemporary artist to figure out how to, interact their own concepts and bring this to a different kind of life. I think there's so many possibilities for this space.
Amazing. I look forward to seeing it one day in the museum.
Let me know when you're coming.
This might be too broad of a question, but you mentioned a lot of the decisions that you have to make about authenticity and keeping them. Do you know about the authorities, people in charge in India, and if they've had to update their sort of philosophy? Because you talked before about how they used to think that a huge part of honoring the gods was updating it. Do you know any of the decisions they've? This is like too broad a question, but do you know if they are sort of going through the same decisions? Have you looked into any of the same decisions on their half that you had to deal with?
Well, I mean, I talked about the period of the 1930s and how things were changing, you know, the idea of heritage, which was sort of a more European archaeological idea, was coming in. The idea of ownership by Hindus was coming in, and a certain kind of not just the sacred images that had, or the icons, the embodied gods, were something that you kept and honored, but pretty much everything. And that, I think, was part of this movement. There was a movement for cultural independence that was happening at the same time as people were trying to break away from Britain, and all of that was going on. Bring it up to the present, and the current Indian, the current attitudes are, it's much more, it's nationalistic. So there is absolutely a feeling that, you know, all Indian art, all Indian heritage, particularly anything that has to do with religion, should come back to the country. That's why, if you read the newspaper, you see, you know, that there are individuals, because the government is just overwhelmed. They couldn't focus on that. There's groups of individuals who got together to track down objects that were illegally taken from the country. And I started as an architectural historian, so I've actually, you know, I've told people, like, you shouldn't have that. It came out of this temple ceiling at a time when it shouldn't have. And it's only now that you actually get a response to that. But it's more complicated than that in India, because you have the national government having its own agenda, and then you have the South Indian, the Tamil, and they speak a very different language, a different language group, and they have their own agenda, especially for bringing the bronzes, which are not only embodied gods, but have the highest monetary value of any kind of Indian art. And so there's been a really big move for a number of years to bring those back. What happens to them when they get in the country, that's a different story. But it's definitely an ongoing transformation of how you think about the sacred, how you think about, and the word authentic itself is something that has just such massive different interpretations. I mean, you know, I tend to say that, well, in a sense, a museum experience has its, any human experience has its own kind of authenticity. So where do you begin or stop being authentic? I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
Yeah, over the course of time when artifacts were plundered, you know, and it's always the argument that, well, that country doesn't have the resources to preserve them, the Elgin marbles as an example, and how that's going. So today, now it's becoming a big deal, you know, whether they're sacred items or just cultural items. And how is it going? Because, you know, really, some countries are so poor that if you give their artifacts back, you know, they just don't have the resources to take care of them, you know, unless you're providing money for them to look after these things. And, you know, it's like like you say, it's an ongoing thing, but, you know, if you look at a lot of the art magazines now, that's a big issue, especially in America with Indian artifacts, you know, and how those are starting to be given back and, you know, how sacred that is. So maybe talk about that.
Well, this is what I said at the beginning, the returners versus the retainers. And, you know, because I did begin as an architectural historian of temples, I have a very strong passion that, you know, you don't destroy monuments, but that when something is taken illegally, and a lot of, you know, the things that have been returned were not taken under US law, or we know exactly, you know, okay, there's the feet of the sculpture in Cambodia and the rest of it's sitting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You know where it was. You know, there's no, that can be put back, and to make the excuse that Cambodia can't take care of its own thing, that's, okay, this is entirely my decision, my opinion. And now that I don't work for a museum, I can say that that kind of object, it is not our decision to make the choice for somebody else. And you also don't know where a country is going to go. I mean, we had 9/11. So if the Elgin marbles had been sitting, you know, in the United States, who knows what could happen to the British Museum. Greece is in a very different place now than it was. India is in a very different place now than it was 50 years ago. They have plenty of money to take care of anything that goes back. Does it go back to the site itself? Not necessarily, because there's internal hierarchies and internal power plays going on as well. So there's not a simple answer, but I don't think that you know, something that was gotten hold of through a dealer or a series of dealers to a collector that, you know, we can prove, or, you know, somebody in India can prove, was literally stolen, was illegally out of that country, or was smashed off of the building, that has any, that we have any say in what happens to that. But no, I don't have a crystal ball to know where that's going to go in the future. But I think, you know, one of the reasons I wrote this, and one of the reasons I got more and more and more into the example, was that it's really gotten to be like, you know, like Washington, like you're on two sides of the aisle, and there's no discussion of those gray areas, and this is definitely one of those gray areas. And I think any object, as you really start digging, you find that there's both sides of the story coming together. And if we could talk about it, that would be the way to get help with the conservation needs that happen in the country. I think Japan is the perfect example, and it happened early in the 20th century, late 19th century, where they, you know, put in an entire system of, you know, listing the antiquities in the country, kind of cataloging them by what were national treasures, what were important cultural properties, what could lead having a trade in objects, and that system has worked amazingly well. India is not Japan, I grant you that. But, you know, as we move forward, if we're having the dialogue, we're going to get somewhere. If we're just on either side of the aisle, nothing's going to happen.
I was wondering if there is active negotiation to get the bronzes back, and do we know where they are? Or do we have some of those?
There's many. there's many South Indian bronzes, there's many other kinds of bronzes, you know, in museums around the world, because they have been collected since the 18th century or earlier. They're exquisite, they're portable, they're in the round, so they're something that is very appealing to a Western audience. Some, because there was actual evidence, photographs of them coming out from India at times that were, you know, not legal, not appropriate, and those have been repatriated, and that process continues to go on. Others have not, and remain here. It's hard because many of these things were taken out a really long time ago, and even with the bronzes, even despite the monetary value, and much worse with fragments of stone, receipts just essentially didn't exist. You know, there's very little written evidence. And it's really hard, you know, on the flip side, it's actually almost impossible for museums to purchase something from India now that is not of a very recent origin. And I think it's been moved up, but within probably a couple of months, the Indian government is working with the US government to put in a 5-year total ban on anything of Indian origin over 75 to 100 years old being allowed into the United States. Now, when you think about it, that's pretty weird because it doesn't just involve antiquities. It involves, like, your grandmother's sari, or maybe your mother's sari, or wedding jewelry, or, you know, whatever. And, you know, they're hoping that that will be permanent. So it's really in a state of flux. But yes, these bronzes exist here. At the same time, there's a number of them that were smuggled. I mean, there's, you know, some people who are sitting in jail right now because they literally went into temples that were like the one, you know, like the one at the Gopaswami when it had no money. The doors were going to be closed. The bronzes would have been sitting there. They actually had a gang of thieves that broke in and took the bronzes and kind of money laundered them through the market and sold them again. And those have been returned to India, and the perpetrators have been captured. But there's all different ways that this happened, and you know, many are quite legitimately in collections around the world, and in temples around the world, because Hindus do not only exist in India.
You mentioned having a contemporary artist possibly work in Philadelphia there. And I then was thinking about the question of contemporary art and relationship to cultural property and authenticity, and whether things should cross borders. Because I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, about how we regard contemporary art. And there's a vivid contemporary art scene in India today, which is very international. Galleries come and go. Yet we seem to put that in a different place in our brains than we do, say, discarded temple fragments or something. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just sort of philosophically, the difference there, and whatever the, you know, ethics that are involved?
Yeah, I mean, I have thoughts on it, and I know a whole lot of artists in India who have thoughts on it, and who themselves are, you know, very fine art historians. I think, you know, when I was working on temples, and I would come back, and I would literally see a sculpture that I knew smashed off of the wall, that gave me a very strong reason to say that protection and is extremely important, and something has to happen. It doesn't mean that everything goes back or everything stays. I mean, it's not that duality. But in terms of contemporary art, you know, the artists themselves made them as global communication. They're traveling. They're on the internet. they're, it's a totally different world for today's artists. They really want to be seen as contemporary artists. You wouldn't say that, well, this is an Italian artist, and this is an English artist, and this is a New York artist. Well, why would you say that this is an Indian artist and has to only be shown with, other Indian art? And that I feel very strongly about. When I was living there back in the 80s, I spent a lot of time at the major art school with artists who are now, and I mentioned two senior artists in India, but who also had to take a lot of art history. So they're very aware of this, and they're also very aware of their place within that ecosystem. And at that point, the only way that they could get their work shown outside of India was to have an exhibition, as part of a group exhibition on art from India, contemporary art from India, contemporary art from India. It just kept happening again and again. And I just hope that we've gotten beyond that and can finally start to say this is just a really extraordinary master who should, either have, a retrospective of a one-person show, or should just be integrated into a thematic show where nation state is not the primary
Organizing principle.
organizing principle.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is really beautiful. And I just wanted to ask your thoughts on if what you're talking about when dismantling the temple and replacing it with fresher and newer pieces, it reminded me of the Grand Ise Shrine in Japan and how they rebuild that every few decades. And they do it not only for various reasons, but one of them being to continue the cultural practice of how to build and keep that traditional vocational practice. And do you see that in this form of dismantling and rebuilding their temples as they start to disintegrate over time?
That's such a great question. No, I don't. No, but it's such a cool comparison. The reason why things get rebuilt, and it doesn't happen as much in the north and in other parts of India as it does in the south, but the reason they get rebuilt is because they're damaged, or because there's a patron who wants to have religious merit by, offering this. It's these priest architects who pass down the building traditions through texts over generations. But the buildings change. There's not an attempt to make exactly the same structure again and again. So because of that, I would say, no, it's not this. And also because, they're not made out of wood, they're made out of stone. But the way they're constructed, and this is across India, is that they are pre-carved. Each block is pre-carved, like a jigsaw puzzle to fit together. The final details are done once it's already constructed, but they're completely dry laid. There is no mortar used. So they can be taken apart when things get damaged and put back together. I mean, not put back together, like a new one put in its place. But the new ones that show up in the style of that era. So there's not a ritual or emotional heritage attachment to that continuity of craftsmanship.
Thank you so much.